My name is Jochem Kroezen. I'm an associate professor at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And I've been visiting the center over the last week. And I've mostly been talking about craft and trying to talk about craft not just as a context, but as a concept. And starting by the idea that craft is something that, or is a notion that we use a lot. We use a lot in our writing, we use a lot actually in our research. But it's poorly understood and it's often poorly defined. I spent some time going back in history, right, looking at how craft has been theorized. And there we see that craft is often approached in a relatively narrow sense, right? So craft primarily has been associated with a more primitive or traditionalistic approach to manufacturing. And more recently, we have indeed seen a lot of attention to the so-called craft revival in our post-industrial societies. And here craft perhaps, right, sort of the epitome of this revival can be found in the case of craft brewing, right, which is this extraordinary case where craft came back in an industry that was significantly industrialized, homogenized, or orchestrated around mass consumption. Right? And craft really emerges here as this strong sort of oppositional force, right? So craft in opposition to industry, craft as a return also to the roots of the sector, right? Bringing back traditional ways of producing, craft as an alternative way to create meaningful forms of work, craft as a way of relating differently with the materials at hand, a less wasteful approach also to manufacturing and consuming. So this is interesting, right? This is an interesting force, but my argument is that also here craft still appears in a relatively narrow sense, right? So some authors have described these examples as specifically as neo-crafts, right? And these forms of craft we often see in the more gentrified urban centers, right? So not just in brewing, but you could also find it potentially in the barber shop or the butcher shop, like Richard Osijo described quite vividly. What I'm quite interested in is actually to show how craft can be a lens, right, or broader perspective on any form of work, expanding the way we use the notion of craft to also allow us to look at other forms of work, right? So, for instance, right, we could look at our own field, right? So academic research, increasingly, we're concerns about our craft in the age where we can also use AI to produce a paper. Or teaching, right? Or specifically, we could look at jobs that have fundamentally changed over the last decades. So I'm interested in primary education as an example of an occupation that's very similar to beer brewing, or right, the brew master, right? Someone that was working in primary education as a teacher used to have high status and increasingly has been subjugated to follow instructions or methods designed elsewhere. Right, so in my current research, I'm trying to enter the conversation with the literature on professions and occupations, where I actually found in this literature that there's also this sort of demeaning view of craft, where craft sits in strong opposition to professions, right? Where we have professions on the one hand that have control over an abstract domain of expertise that allows them to control other types of occupations, such as craft occupations, right? That we see as being mostly driven by technical forms of knowledge, right? I'm trying to challenge this strong dichotomy and saying that there's some craft in any type of occupation, and regardless of whether or not we call this a profession or not, we can find craft. And then I'm challenging this idea that occupations tend to, or ideally want to follow this sort of linear trajectory, right? Where over time they become professionalized in these bureaucratic ways, right, where they claim this control over formal body of expertise through accreditation and things like that. I want to challenge that because I think that there's also we can also imagine alternative trajectories where actually occupations become more craft-like, and craft can actually be a source of status. Something that I have seen quite clearly in the beer brewing field, where the brewmaster again became a position or a role at the heart of a sector, a role with a massive degree of status as well, and everybody wanted to be close to that role. We can see that happen in other fields as well, potentially. Or in any case, we can imagine that potentially happening elsewhere, right? So a role like the primary school teacher ordineurs is something that we might actually see being elevated if we reinfuse elements of craft or start to reimagining it again as craft, which might actually be quite important for our societies, where currently we struggle also to really find people that want to do this important kind of work. So that's where my project is. Lots to explore still, but I was very grateful to be able to discuss this during my time at the ABC Center.